Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Billy Wilder Theater tonight. We are so thrilled tonight to have the artist Lap-See Lam in person, all the way from Stockholm. Her current Hammer exhibition, Tales of the Altar Sea, is an immersive video installation that we'll hear more about tonight, and I hope you've had a chance to see it. It's in the gallery space, just 2 doors down off of the Hammer courtyard. Lap-See Lam was born in Stockholm, Sweden, where she lives and works today. She obtained her master's degree in fine art in 2020 from the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm. Her work explores questions of representation and interpretation, working both with contemporary technology and traditional references and techniques. Her work is included in the permanent collections of the Cadis Foundation, Moderna Musik, Malmö Konstmuseum, Röhsska Musik, and Public Art Agency in Sweden. And her work was selected to fill the Nordic Pavilion at the last Venice Biennale, where she staged the Altar Sea Opera, which she conceived and conceptualized and realized it in collaboration with a composer, costume designer, and set designer. It was absolutely incredible. I hope that we're going to hear more about that tonight as well. Lap-See will be in conversation with Pablo José Ramírez, who is a curator here at the Hammer Museum, working on all kinds of exhibitions, including the Chirani exhibition in the theater lobby right now, which is fantastic, and Lap-See Lam's current installation. Prior to the Hammer, Pablo was the inaugural curator of First Nations and Indigenous art at the Tate Modern in London, where he advocated for scholarship, collecting, and exhibiting Indigenous and non-Western art practices. After tonight's presentation, we'll have a chance to continue the conversation over some light refreshments out in the lobby. And now please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lap-See Lam and Pablo José Ramírez.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for the applause. Um, Thank you for being here. I'm really happy that we made it work with Lapsy. I mean, for those of you who follow the Hammer a little closely, we opened this show back in January, and it was not. I mean, it was a very difficult time for the arts community and like the LA community at large. The plan was to have you here, and in the end, we decided to push your visit for later. Um, it's been an incredible experience working with you, and also uh, understanding a little bit more about your, not just your practice, but the way you engage with artistic practice at large, moving image, and it was fun and it was intense to work on the install. And the idea was now having Lapsy here and sharing more about her work, sharing a little more about like the different projects, not just what we are seeing here at the Hammer. So that's the plan for today. We have images, we have videos, and we'll just kick off and have a little chat, right? So I'll just start by saying that when I was thinking about inviting Lapsy to the Hammer and to have this project, something important for me was to think about the relationship between, I guess, kind of the diasporic experience and making art, and how those two things connect. And I guess I will just start by asking you about uh, probably a very general question. What do you think is the kind of connection, or if there is an inherently kind of creative connection between the diasporic experience and art? What's going on there? Like you could even say like between, I guess, trauma, movement, and displacement, and creating art
Mm,
within your experience.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the introduction. Um, so happy to be here. Thank you for being here and to be able to show this quite complex work and complex installation that we did with the artist displaced, but now I'm here. Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, the diasporic experience is, not only about history. It's like something that is almost like a state of mind or a tool in my work, not only embedded in the in the storytelling and the thematics, but also a tool. The diasporic experience is so much about fragmentation, about translation, about many layers and things that are shifting. And that is, I see it as, very much mirrored in the way I work. I use different medias, and I follow how the material evolves in my process, and let that kind of shape the stories that I tell. Very much like in the diasporic experience.
And Lapsi, would you share? I guess we can just also go look back a little bit and think about this trilogy that somehow was foundational for the work we're seeing at the Hammer, Tales of the Altar Sea. There is a lot to unpack there, but let's just start by like a general introduction. I guess for those who are probably not too familiar with your practice, I mean, we can think about like Mother Stone, Phantom Banquet, and Dreamer's Quay. I know we have a lot of material here, so if you want to just give a general introduction, thinking about this idea of the diasporic experience and the kind of kind of the like art in general, right? So, how would you do that? How would you just share a little introduction of like how you end up doing this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, I mean, I would describe my work as a collaborative world building practice, a story which is still being written in present time. My work my works are all connected to each other, not like chapters within a fixated sort of lineage, story wise, but they are connected to each other almost like a root system, like a rhizome that branches out in different directions. And sometimes I choose to develop the story of a certain character or a certain space or a material, and I really let the material sort of tell me what kind of story should be told. I believe a lot in this idea of inherited stories that are maybe in a way present but untold. So I create material, I build this world digitally, physically, to let these stories grow from there. And to do this, I collaborate a lot. I collaborate with musicians, with family members, friends, different experts from fields. So I see it really as something that I would call a world building practice.
Lapsi, you grew up in Stockholm. You have had this sort of, I guess, like a trope that is not like like sometimes with artists there are things, kind of topics that pop up in different moments of their career, right? Like with you, the relationship with the Chinese diaspora and specifically with restaurants, and I would say with material culture, like everything that is manifested in the experience of like a family restaurant. Um, what can you share about that? And I don't know if you want to then connect a little bit with Phantom Banquet and Mother's Tongue, and tell us about the process of working with those projects.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that as a student, or maybe I can tell you a little bit about my background and the sort of core project that turned into all of these different projects, was a work called Mother's Tongue. And that was the result of a very personal project I started in 2017, I think. And I was grown up in a Chinese restaurant in Sweden, a very typical Western Chinese restaurant, with both a menu and interior very much adapted to the Western gaze. And this restaurant was opened by my grandmother in the 60s after she had migrated from Hong Kong to London to work in Chinatown, and then she brought all of that sort of knowledge with her to Sweden. And eventually my parents took over, and we lived in the same building where the Chinese restaurant was located. So I think me as a second generation Hong Kong Swedish immigrant, or Hong Kong Swedish, I think me and my siblings navigated through understanding that restaurant as as a place of duality, with a double nature. We understood it as a sort of performative space, almost seeing our parents working there, performing this kind of Chineseness, and seeing and feeling that this is a culture that is fabricated somehow. But then at the same time, it is also the source. Like we learned a lot about our Chinese or Hong Kong Chinese ancestry through the Chinese restaurant, through the symbols of what could it be, the Ming style or chinoiserie that we found, that we saw every day in the interior, or the name of the dishes, and so on and so on. So I think that double nature of the space made us quite aware of the performance of Chineseness. And I didn't have words for it when I was a child in Sweden. I didn't have the vocabulary for it. And it wasn't until I started on this project of documenting these type of Chinese restaurants in Sweden, during a time when my parents were about to sell the restaurant. So I felt a need to document that space, and then through the process of that and so on, these projects came to be alive.
Yeah, I think that the idea that when your family restaurant was about to be sold, you kind of thought about the need of documenting that, and that documentation somehow became part of your kind of artistic repertoire. And I find it, I mean, interesting for many reasons, but also because that I think that, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but also that was the moment probably within your own practice where you move between the kind of realness of a space and your own personal experience to this sort of digitalization of that experience that also told you something about your practice at large, but also about yourself. And I mean, you were showing us some pictures last time. I don't know if you want to show some things about the 3D scans and kind of say a little more about like when that came to be and how because you started taking 3D scans of the restaurant. I mean, not just your families, but many other places, right?
Yeah, many similar ones, and I brought my father on this journey through Sweden to document similar restaurants, and I needed his help. I needed his contact with the rest of the Swedish Cantonese community in order to do that. And I think what happened when I started to work on these 3D scans in the post-production in the computer, was that something unexpected happened. And we will see it in the clip that I will show. So maybe we'll have a look at that clip and then we continue from there. Yeah.
Du som lyssnar undrar nog vem jag är. Vem är du då? Den här frågan, så ofta ställd, tyder på att det finns ett svar. Som om vi var en fast sak. Jag är inte säker. Jag är en pågående process. En flödande känsla. Ett mellanrum där jag inramas, omorganiseras, omtänker och omdefinierar mig själv. Det har gått 3 sekler sedan jag blev till. Och jag minns varenda en av dem. Generationer som passerat. De som stannat, flyttat, dött och fötts. Vad jag är summan av min omvärld. Och så här började allt.
Hela vägen till vårdcentralen tjatade du i mitt öra. Aja, Thaileja, din tunga är stor som en persika. Jag har sagt för flera veckor sedan, men du lyssnar aldrig. Mamma sa att det berodde på Jihei. Varje åkomma beror alltid på Jihei. Luften i kroppen är för varm och den kan bara balanseras ut med ett hälsosamt liv eller en brygd som hon påstår är medicin. Förra veckan kokade hon upp några grenar, torkade örter, typ ett fågelbo, inte vet jag. Tvingade mig att dricka den 3 gånger per dag och det funkade ju uppenbarligen inte. Tungan var verkligen stor som en persika, spänd och uppblåst i min mun. Hos läkaren tvingar hon mig sedan att översätta fast jag knappt kan prata. Mamma skäms över sin svenska trots att hon egentligen klarar sig själv, så jag får agera som språksköld som alltid. En gång försökte jag fråga moster om det, men hon svarade bara att aja, du förstår inte kineserna för du är ju ett bananbarn. Jag hade aldrig hört uttrycket förut, så moster förklarade att bananbarn är de som har gult skinn men vitt hjärta. Efter det frågade jag inte mer.
I'm just trying to think of, like, as I see this, I'm trying to imagine you in the context of your family and the restaurant. And I mean, I think most of us have had like an experience somewhere in a Chinese restaurant. And for you was, of course, like a personal experience. I don't know if you could say a little more about how was to scan these places. Was it like a process of kind of encountering or more of alienation, in the sense that I imagine like by scanning something you tend to look at things that you didn't look before, so you are also finding things even if you grew up there, for instance. So I'm just curious about how was that, like the scanning of that.
I mean, first of all, it was a very, for me, important social experience to meet with a lot of the, the same generation as my parents. They know each other, even though we're not all related. They're friends. Like, they know each other from time back. So it was a beautiful experience to be part of that. And it almost became anthropological, like in that sense, to go into these spaces, to scan them. And just to give you some context, I think the Swedish Cantonese diaspora really hasn't been documented or written or talked about a lot in the Nordic countries. So during that moment, it started like as a personal with a personal need, from a personal need. But then the more I did it and the more I interacted with all of these restaurateurs, I understood that this was a history that would be soon gone if it wasn't documented somehow. So it was in the process I understood maybe the importance of it. But while I did the scanning, I wasn't working on the post-production until a bit later. So I didn't have a plan. I didn't have, a written script or a plan for these narratives to take form. I only did that quite intuitively and from a quite naive perspective regarding the material and what could be done.
And you mentioned a couple of times this idea, this sort of concept of generational loss that you kind of learn about while working on these projects. Would you tell us a little more about what that is? And
Yeah, so when I was working with the material, I noticed that it behaved differently from what I had originally planned. So my vague idea was to create these hyper-realistic renderings of these spaces and then let that become something. But while I was working with the material in the computer, I noticed all of these the glitches that you see in the material. It had holes. It was fragmented. It almost, became like a shell of these restaurants. So this created almost like a third space of these after images of the Hong Kong diaspora. And I read about this term called generational loss or generation loss, which is a computational term that describes when you move one file to another place or you make copies of that file, every time you move it or do that, you lose some information. And I started to think about that, or that term gave me sort of a language to think about this idea of cultural identity and within the diasporic context, and how language and material and knowledge can be distorted when you recontextualize or in the process of displacement. And that became sort of a catalyst in my work and is something that I still carry with me when I make my work. That notion of something slippering away.
which probably speaks to probably speaks to the image we're looking at here as well, right? Like, this sort of anthropomorphic figure that is, I mean, it's anthropomorphic, but it's also kind of abstracted a little bit, like there but not there in a way, right?
Yeah, and this neon sculpture is based on a form. So when I 3D scanned the restaurants, and this was made we had to adjust, of course, our time to the open to the times of when the restaurants were open and so on. So many times there was maybe people in the restaurant, and it wasn't until I worked with the material that I noticed that we had accidentally scanned people who passed by the scanner, and the scanner would sort of catch this millisecond of a person in motion, and that would create these sort of skeletal, phantom-like figures stuck in motion, which you could maybe also see in that clip. So I fused those forms and put them in the physical space in the shape of this neon figure, for example.
And I guess this takes us a little bit to this, as you just said, the idea of glitch, right? And how is that when you were doing these scans, there were, besides the architecture of the space, there were somehow people that would be kind of in between the scan, and then they would just show up, right, as these kind of like ghosts. Um, and when I was thinking about ghosts in your practice, I was also thinking about the idea of memory and how is that also, there are different memories, kind of layers of memory that are erased, but then we get new, right? Like that's kind of the whole idea of generations as well. We lose, but at the same time we gain things and we change. So ghosts could be also be seen as memories, right? And these kind of like fading memories.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in my work, ghosts are maybe metaphor for something unresolved too. And in many cases, within my work, not only like embedded in the material, but in the collaborations I do with my family and my father, for example, I use them as co-creators of the different stories that are part of the work, and it is a way for me to get close to these stories, to access them, to access these ghosts through them that they are unable to tell for different reasons. So that also connects to, this idea of generational loss but generational gain, like what do we create out of that wound or that space. And I really see my work as a way to create this overlap between these gaps.
And this is, I think, a good way to do a little jump and think about. I mean, the show here, Tales of the Altar Sea, the idea of storytelling as well, kind of how you translate, kind of like how you share memories. And I think storytelling is an important component of your practice. And did you guys see the show? I'm assuming everyone saw it already. So tell us a little bit about storytelling and how what is the role of that in your practice. I guess you can talk connected to mythologies and so on, but there is something very kind of strong about sharing stories, right? And in a very earnest, also almost kind of like kind of very straightforward way. You are literally sharing stories within your practice.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that because I also I'm not a storyteller, or like I find myself struggling with telling a story like in this way. That's why I'm like so nervous on this stage, and like I find it hard to verbalize and do all of that. But in my practice, that's the only way for me to tell stories somehow. And storytelling, I mean, I don't usually have the stories, and I don't work in the traditional sense with a script or script writing. The way that I work, it's almost reversed. So I collect materials, I collect stories in the form of fragments, and I go back, eh, go back thinking about memories, maybe from my childhood or things that I've been told, and I create these spaces, often virtually, and it's sort of almost like I create a ground or a universe for stories to to grow from, to be able to grow from. And it sounds a bit silly, but sometimes it feels like I am not the narrator of these stories. It is the stories that kind of come through the material. And that is something, I mean, I learned that when working with the 3D scanned material, and to really let the process or the creative process be open, and to let the material lead you into what stories you want to tell. And yeah, that is like, it's a lot about assembling times and materials and really over time. So when I made Tales of the Altar Sea, for example, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a script. I was making these characters and animating them within this digital space in Unity, and invited people to, like Linus and Marlena, to collaborate on the music, and they created music for something that didn't have a script. And then I slowly let that become something.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, I mean, just to say something very basic about like narrative and storytelling is that I think when we hear storytelling or the idea of narrative, we think that there is, you know, a beginning and an end. So you have like a sort of like kind of like narrative structure. You start here, you tell a story, and you end here. When we see your practice and we see this with the Tales of the Altar Sea, there is no narrative structure in that way. It's like, and it's also how I guess the world is, right? You get immersed in a space and there are many things happening at the same time, and you kind of select what thing you want to follow, right? So like being here with your show, it's also a little bit of that. Like you are kind of influenced and you have many different things happening simultaneously. And I guess that speaks to what you were saying, right? It's kind of like a reverse narrative structure where things happen at the same time and they connect, but also they don't have to connect, right? In that way. And I don't know if there is something here that you would like to share to kind of illustrate that kind of idea of world building and narrative.
What do you think? Perhaps we should jump to
That could be nice. The
Dreamer's Key.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Wait! I come to a halt at a room divider. Mom had a similar one at Troy's garden. The motifs are gold, silver, and red, depicting a river with rowing boats and ships.
There's the dragon boat, says the prince. They are having a big celebration where they offer gifts. He smiles slyly. A large, gleaming key falls out of his suit.
Wait! Did you have it all along?
Right then, the master of ceremonies enters the hall. Catch the thief! She stole my key! The prince exclaims, pointing at Ayan. The master of ceremonies looks furious. His cheeks are red against the white wig. The two guards behind him pull their sabers and the blades look really sharp.
One of the guards looks me in the eye. He has a thin, twirled mustache and a scar on his cheek.
就好似臘腸狗打扮成貴婦狗一樣，你可以繼續你嘅旅程，但係唔好忘記仔細嘅觀察。
What do you mean? He's saying you can continue on your journey like a dachshund disguised as a poodle, but don't forget to look closely.
Just as the master of ceremonies pulls at her skirts, Ayan turns towards the room divider. The image vibrates and the waves are moving. She takes a step and disappears into the picture with the river and the dragon boat.
Lap-See, would you share a little bit about probably for those who are not too familiar with the kind of tradition of Chinese puppetry and like shadow, that is of course like a reference to kind of like oceanic kind of like trade. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So what you saw now is an excerpt from a work called Dreamer's Key, which was the work I made prior to Tales of the Altar Sea. And Dreamer's Key, like Tales of the Altar Sea, is made inspired by this method of shadow play, but with imagery and material used both from 3D scans of Chinese restaurants, but also from other places, such as the Chinese castle in Stockholm, which is a typical sort of chinoiserie, Rococo style castle made for the royal family in the 1700s, which connects a lot to the trade between Sweden and China during a time when the demand for the Western demand for Chinese goods were different and high. And I made a work which was a sort of time travel from a present Chinese restaurant back to the 1700s and 1800s to make that connection between chinoiserie in history and today. And one of the and this was also the first time I worked with the dragon ship as a protagonist. And when I made a work, I could also make the connection of shadow play also as a traditional technique and a traditional storytelling that had migrated from China to Europe through the sea routes, basically. And yeah.
And now that we're looking at the kind of floating palace restaurant, this story connects to the work we have at the Hammer, and it's kind of. I mean, I'm kind of always kind of insane that you found this restaurant and the story of you being an art student, and then looking at this kind of thematic park, amusement park, and then finding that this used to be a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, and then it was kind of transformed into how you call it, like a hunting house, right? It's almost like you're not looking at those stories and then they kind of follow you in a way, right? Maybe because you're looking at things that not everybody is. So would you share something about like what we're seeing here?
Yeah, sure. So you're seeing the image of the dragon ship that I like, the protagonist of my previous works, and it's also moored here by an amusement park in Stockholm, and it was exactly like this. I found it for the first time. So I was an art student by that time, and sitting and working with the works that I mentioned in the 3D lab. And then I look over, and on the other side of the water, I see this ship appear. And I started to do some interviews and research about it. And it turned out that, like you described, it was made in Shanghai in 1991. It traveled to Gothenburg to function as a Chinese restaurant, but it failed. And then the owner, the entrepreneur, he brought it to different port cities in Europe, and it continued to fail. And then it ended up as a haunted house at this amusement park. So it was so interesting for me that it had all of these layers that with the themes that I was working with, the ghosts, spectrality, and also just to mention that the original appearance also had a head and a tail of a Chinese dragon. And when I did the research, I learned that apparently the amusement park, they were renting it during Halloween, and they had created this sort of Orientalist vocabulary and story surrounding it. Something along like a 1,000-year-old story, like a 1,000-year-old ship that had traveled from the Orient with its evil curse, etc., etc. And they had also reanimated the dragon into a sinister dragon. And in Chinese culture, the dragon is a good force. It is the protector of the water, an icon. So what happened was that the owner of the ship, who is Shanghainese, he had already signed the contract to rent this out. And as I think a way of protecting the icon, he decided to remove its head and tail. And that's hence this. So he only rented out the belly of or the body of the ship to the amusement park, and they filled it with, you can imagine like horror props inside of it. And this was so interesting for me. The fact, the act of removal of the head and tail, but also just the fact that the dragon had, lost its original purpose, both as a protective icon, but also as business when it traveled from the east to the west, when it traveled over water, and then it also connected with this idea of generational loss. And I started working with this years later, actually. And then I also 3D scanned the space, both interior and exterior, and the head and the tail, and made a work Dreamer's Key. And then continued with the work Tales of the Altar Sea, where the ship has actually sunk to the bottom and the two twin girls sort of resurrect as the dragon. So I think the work for me was about like, how can I resurrect this icon and make this story make sense in somehow.
I think it's also fascinating that like the owner of the ship, the restaurant, I mean, he sold it, but at the same time, there is this sort of like act of resistance, right? Like by taking off the head and the tail, he's like, okay, you can have this, but you cannot really have it, right? And I think that kind of like sort of like kind of act of protection and resistance of something that he knew it was of value and he was not happy with how it was being used. It's very interesting, right? Because it speaks also about some level of adaptability, in terms of like, you need to sell it, but also you can do something about it, right? And you were saying something about how is that when you presented this in Venice, I mean, you were in touch with him, right? And you brought the head and the tail.
Yeah, in Venice, just to show. So let me find it. There. And this one. So for the next project after Tales of the Altar Sea, I was invited to create a Gesamtkunstwerk in the Nordic pavilions in collaboration with two other practitioners. We invited a composer called Seung Ho and an artist called Khulud Havash. And for this work, we brought the actual head and the tail all the way to Venice. And then we worked with bamboo scaffolding to create this sort of imaginary ship. Let me see if I can jump over here. So you enter into the pavilion, into the scaffold, which is the outline of the ship. And we use that and to create this stage for an opera, inspired by many different things, but one of the main inspiration sources was Cantonese opera.
You tell me if I'm wrong also, but what was very interesting to me when I visited the Biennale, and so this was this sort of contrast between this heavy head. It's just like monumental structure, So it's just very like heavy and visually just present. But then that in contrast with the bamboo and the sort of like, I guess, I don't know if precarity is the word, but bamboo is a structure that feels light. And I think that was very beautiful on how you were sort of juxtaposing the heaviness of the probably story of the ship in relation to this fragility of the bamboo, right? It worked pretty nicely.
Yeah, and actually, it looks fragile in its like organic form, but it's very strong, and the structure we used it for the performers to climb in, and it is a material and a technique which is used, for example, in Hong Kong, since it's a 1,000-year-old technique that has been used in both scaffolding industry, but also to create these temporary stages for Cantonese opera.
Was it fun to bring the head to Venice?
It was a process, definitely. But we also brought. It was. Now it's been a year, and it was. We had to really look at different solutions to get it to Venice, but it was fantastic to see it there in place. Unused, like it's been unused for so many years.
Right, and also like the whole installation was activated, right, during the whole Biennale, every like many times. No?
The performance, the opera was activated in the beginning of the opening, but then as an installation, it was activated.
Lap-See, and wrapping up, I would like to just kind of like sort of loop back to the idea of world building and this sort of something you've been talking about like for some time now. It's this sort of relationship between how the Western world tends to kind of this sort of drive or desire to exotify in general non-Western cultures, including Chinese culture. And your practice navigates this sort of intricate space, right? Like it engaged with this sort of like aesthetics of exotification because of all of the tradition that you just mentioned of Chinese restaurants and so on. But at the same time, it takes distance because you are creating your own narratives. And something that for me was very important to make clear when we did the project here was that, there is world building and, in a way there are these sort of like something that feels like almost like fantastical worlds. But it is not fantasy in the way that we are used to think about like fantasy, right? As something that is, I guess, to put it like simple, like not real, right? Not really connected to our lives, to our daily lives. I guess the question is how you navigate this sort of tension between the desire of the Western world to consume certain type of cultural products, and at the same time your position, your critical position within it, right?
I think that goes back to, I mean, what I describe as the double nature of, of the Chinese restaurant, of the diasporic experience, of being able to navigate between all of that. And what I tend to do, or what I try to do in my installations, is that I want to position the viewer into sort of this emotional space of feeling that doubleness. So what I don't want to do is to point that out in a simplistic way. I want you to kind of feel that tension, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course, it does make sense. Yeah, I think the tension feels when you are experiencing something and you kind of need to think of your own stand against what you're seeing, right? And that kind of space, because you're kind of looking back at the observer as well, right? It's like how you situate yourself within your installations, right? When you're looking at them. This was really good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I think we can kind of like check if someone has a question. Don't be shy. Otherwise, I mean, if no questions, okay, there is someone there.
I thought wow, it's loud, isn't it? I thought that it was absolutely magical and yet threatening at the same time, and really just loved it. I'm curious about the name, Alter Sea, how you came to that.
Yeah, a very good question. Alter Sea, I think it's a combination of two words. Alterity, which means otherness, and then we have the sea. So I think I'm trying to think back how this came to be, the combination of them two, but you don't see it in this installation, but when I made Tales of the Alter Sea, I created this almost like a cartography, like a map, and to be able to connect it with the other works, Dreamer's Key, Mother's Tongue, Phantom Banquet. There's always like this idea of there's a geography, sort of. And Alter Sea became everything that linked these places together. So, and that is where we are in the piece as well.
Hi, it's a very beautiful work. I'm glad that I could came here to listen to you. I was wondering about the first pieces that you show about the restaurants and the scanning and the works that you finally made, and if the community have seen those works and how they have responded to them.
Yeah, I mean, so Mother's Tongue, for example, in the making of the work, I included both my mother, a cousin, and also a cousin to my mother. So I think through them and the collaborators that I work with, there's like this ripple effect to the different communities, or the Cantonese community in Hong Kong. And yeah, the response has been overwhelmingly like beautiful. And I think the best thing with, I just opened a show in Stockholm showing Floating Sea Palace, my latest work, and my grandmother brought all of her friends there and is still doing that. And although some of them say that they don't understand the work, they are the ones who understand it like the most, I think. Yeah, but it is hard. I mean, these spaces, these art spaces are can be very limiting, and you have to really work actively, inviting people that, I mean, my parents wouldn't go if I didn't have a show there, for example.
Yeah, and I think also that in a way, as you said, right, these spaces tend to be kind of alienating by nature, and sometimes the work does this sort of kind of very interesting thing where it really bridges to communities that you otherwise you would not see in the museum. You know, I think, I mean, that's a good example. And at the Hammers, a couple of times we have these cases where for the opening we have like people that were never here and they just came because they heard that, you know, like a Purepecha collective from Mexico is doing something and then they show up for the opening, right? Which is, I think, is really great.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was curious to hear because you talk about the virtual and the digital in relation to diasporic experience and memory, and you talk about generational loss. So I was curious to hear if it was different working with opera and working with human performers rather than creating digitally.
Yeah, it was very different. I I mean, for the opera, it was such a different experience for me. Like it was a complete different process for me, and I think the whole, you know, Venice setup of making a project less than a year with you know, like on the biggest arena of the art world and all of that craziness, it was difficult to to work in a sense that you keep the like to keep the unexpectedness of it. So for that work, I needed to write sort of a script to be able to share with the composer of the work, and to be able to give the performers something to work with. But I tried really to keep the story, the narration, still open, although it was a little bit very different from how I usually work. Yeah.
I loved your description of your practice as time travel, and I think that 3D scanning is an excellent conduit for that and making your narrative palpable. So I wanted to ask you what brought you to your medium of virtuality.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't. I would say again that it wasn't intentional to work with 3D scanning. I wasn't working in digitally at all. I what happened? I think I heard about the 3D scanner when I was a student, and just immediately was drawn to the technique, the use of the laser as a way to capture like negative space, and I didn't know a lot about it. I didn't even do a test, so I just brought the scanner with me and I think, yeah, just like let that become something, and then I started to look at tutorials. I started learning by doing, and then I got into these different digital tools, engines like Unity and virtual reality. So I would say, just honestly, that the material led me through that process.
I think your work is just magnificent. My question for you is, having grown up in a restaurant myself, everything about your work is symbolic of growing up in duality and multicultural, and restaurant boats, but there's no food. And I'm curious if you were conscientious and purposeful in excluding images of food, which is the essence of restaurants, and what was the thinking process in that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've never been interested in like replicating the restaurant or the purpose or the experience of consuming, how to consume the culture, I think. So for me, it's been conscious in the way that I didn't want to. Wanted to create something else out of it, to experience it from a completely different perspective, I think. But now when I think about it, I have incorporated food actually in one performance. I did Performa in New York in 2019, and Phantom Banquet, the virtual reality work that I made, which is sort of the second iteration after Mother's Tongue, and it's the story about a teenage girl who works at her works at her parents' Chinese restaurant, and she's cleaning a mirror, and then suddenly she travels through that mirror into this mirror world. And in the very first version of that performance, people are invited into a space to eat a piece of that skeletal ghost before entering into that world, which for me now, I see it as a clear reference to like Alice in the Wonderland. Yeah, but that's the only time food has been included in the work. But it wasn't Chinese food. It didn't taste like, didn't taste like that.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. Thank you, Lap-See. This was really fun, and just really appreciate your thoughtful responses and ideas, and it's really great to have you here. And the show is going to be around, so we'll have you here for the next month as well. And thank you to the public programs amazing team, to Jessie DiTilio. She worked with me on this show, and to team and the AB team as well. So thank you for coming.